Shabbat Shalom. So now you have my introduction, and then you have the actual chanting and reading of the Haftarah. So I get to ask you the question. Who's the victim in the Haftarah? I'm going to make you read it again. It's only 20 sentences long. But who's the victim? The guys at the gate. The gatekeeper? The guy who got trampled? Or you mean the lepers who were sitting at the gate? The guy at the gate at the end, right? The aide of the king, who had said, there's no way that God can ever make this much grain happen. Even if God opened up windows in the sky and was pouring grain on us, there's no way this famine's going to break the way you're describing. And Elisha said, you will see it, but you will not eat it. You will not enjoy it. And lo and behold, it came true. Right? He was appointed, rather ironically, to be the gatekeeper as the gates were open and the people were allowed to go to the Aramean camp to get the food and spoils. And, of course, standing between a hungry mob and food, not the safest place to be, and he is trampled. So if he's the victim, who's the victimizer? The people who trampled him? But wasn't it foretold by God that this is what would happen? The guy at the gate. So you mean the victim and the victimizer were one and the same? I think that's probably our best answer in this particular case, that he was a victim of his own stubbornness and his own short-sightedness. As in many ways were the rest of the people who also were unwilling to believe anything good might happen. Remember, they were very reluctant to even bother to send a scout to go see whether this story was true. But we have an almost pathological need when we read stories to identify people as victims or victimizers. One of the things that makes the whole discussion of Sarah, the condition that we've been reading about throughout these chapters, so unsettling to us, is that it doesn't feel fair. It doesn't feel fair that this person who obviously has come down with some horrible, horrible ailment is now being shunned or ostracized or thrown out of the community, or pick whatever verb you like, which doesn't actually fit what happens, but it's what our moral indignation riles us up to imagine is happening. The person is being sent out from inside the camp. Right, so he's over there. Right, this is not called banishment into the wilderness. This is called you stay over there and we stay here. And there he has to wait until the priest continues to come and check on him. You know, the greatest of the great within the community has to go and look and see what things are going on. And every attempt is made to ensure that the person can come back at the earliest possible opportunity. And when they come back, they go through a ritual which makes sure there's no stigma attached to them ever afterwards because of this. And yet we still intuitively almost feel like they are a victim. Or maybe explicitly, if you read some commentaries, describe them as the victim of the outdated, ancient, superstitious, medicinal ideas of our people. And we continue to try and find victims in the modern world as well. And in fact, this drive to identify the victim and then to identify with the victim is a large part of the narrative of Israel's and the Jewish people's experience in the 20th century. At the beginning of Israel's existence, 1948, who were the victims? 1948, who, if you were asking the general newspaper public, if you were asking the people around the world, which group of people are the most victimized people in the world? The Jews. right? We have just come through the horrors of the Holocaust, which have now been laid open to the entire world, who for much of the war refused to believe the truth of what was happening. Now they cannot deny it. Now they are faced with black and white evidence of what has happened, and they are faced with the horror that has been perpetrated against the Jews, and they are also forced to acknowledge their own complicity in either turning Jews away from returning to Israel, as the British did before the war, or of turning Jews away from their own countries did, as just about every country did during and before the war, that they were in no small part responsible for many of the deaths perpetrated under the Nazi regimes. So clearly the Jews are a victim. And in 1948, when the massive armies of the Arab nations attack, who is the victim? The Jews, right? We are a tiny little nation. They are enormous. We have been gone through the worst experience of any people in the world at that particular time. And now we're being attacked again just for having the temerity of wanting to live in peace in our own land. Of course the Jews are the victims. Absolutely. And throughout the next few decades, as Jews are continued to be harassed by the surrounding nations, and the wars continue to bubble along the borders, the sympathy is by and large with Israel, although people's interests are also by and large with the oil-rich Arab nations. So there's a little bit of a conflict of interest, but morally everyone agrees that Israel is still the victim in this dynamic. Along comes 1967. And in 1967 there is yet another war in Israel's history, now called the Six-Day War. And why was it so short? Because despite the provocations and very good reasons to believe violations of international law, which actually triggered Israel's response, the full-scale military attacks were launched first by Israel. It's kind of important to sometimes clear up that it wasn't a preemptive strike in the sense that there was no hostility taking place. It was a preemptive strike only in the sense that Israel massed its attacks first. There were already many acts of war that had been perpetrated by the other sides. So when Israel attacks first, they execute a brilliant plan and execute it brilliantly. And in the process of doing so, they capture the entire Sinai Peninsula, the territories that are now called the West Bank, Gaza, and Golan Heights. And everyone cheers. And as soon as the dust has settled a week later, who are the victims now? In the eyes of the world, who are the victims now? The Arabs, possibly a little bit, depending upon which papers you're reading, but more and more people begin to think the Palestinians. Now, this takes a while because the Palestinians do an awful lot to avoid getting sympathy by carrying out terrorist attacks and other forms of atrocious behavior. But on the whole, you begin to have a sliding process between 67 and then accelerated after the Yom Kippur War, and then hyper-accelerated after the Camp David Accords, and Israel no longer seems to be in the eyes of the world media as in existential danger. The Palestinians more and more become cast as the victim. Despite the bombings, despite the rockets, despite the terrorist attacks, they are cast repeatedly as victims. But why? I mean, the person that goes into a school and blows himself up, how can that be the victim? No explanation? No? You need to be a little bit more creative in your thinking. Because trust me, this is not an unusual thought process. Public relations, right? People believe, only somebody truly desperate would ever do something like this. Therefore, there must be a victimizer of extreme measures that is driving people to behave in this way. Right? Somebody who would get on a bus and explode a vest full of dynamite, what must they have suffered in order to turn them into a living bomb? And therefore, who must their oppressor be? What form of evil must be driving these people to behave so inhumanely? And in this process, as Israel has lost its mantle of victimhood, it is taken from its shoulders and placed upon the shoulders of the Palestinians, despite, and in some cases even because of, the terrorist attacks that they commit. We shouldn't be comfortable with that. But we also shouldn't believe the bad press. That is to say, when someone becomes a victim and you are cast as the victimizer, there are a couple of different options of ways that you can respond to this. You can either become a victimizer and say, well, if I'm going to be called the devil, then I'm going to act as the devil. If there's nothing I can do to convince you that I am not behaving atrociously, then I might as well behave atrociously and be done with it. And indeed, there is a small minority of Jews within the land of Israel and abroad that have taken that tack, and who perpetrate acts of violence and, let's call it what it is, terrorism, against non-Jews who live in the land of Israel or elsewhere. It is a small number, to be sure, and the acts of violence are nothing like the degree or kind that have been perpetrated by others in much larger number against us. But there are many who have said, fine, if you're going to call us the oppressor, then we will oppress you for our own interests. Small amount. A much larger number say, no, you don't deserve the title of victim. We are still the victims. We are the ones who are surrounded by hostile nations. We are the ones who have 1 billion people who have pledged themselves to an ideology of our destruction. We are the people who still have to struggle against an unfair record of UN castigation perpetrated by people that themselves commit some of the worst human rights violations in the entire planet. We are the ones who are now facing boycotts and divestments and sanctions by people who carried out worse attacks within their own lands, but now turn to us and say, you are impure. Much as our sages of old said from the very first aliyah that we read this morning, that when the leper, the Metzora, is crying out, Tameh, Tameh Yikra, impure, impure, he cries, read it with a comma. Tameh, Tameh Yikra. Impure, the impure one cries. That it is those who are most impure that are first to cry out that someone else is impure. We say this in English as the pot calling the kettle black. But there is a third option, because we do not want the mantle of victimhood. That is not our goal. Our haskara, our attempts at explaining both the Jewish and, in particular, the Israeli situation should not be focused on proving that we are more of a victim than they are, because we will not play that role again in history. That may have gotten us sympathy right after the war, and it may have even contributed to the political reality that allowed the establishment of the State of Israel in its first place. But we will not continue to exist as a people simply by demanding that we be the victim, that we be the one who is considered most oppressed, most hated, most debased. This is not an honor that we should be seeking. We can point out the crimes perpetrated against us by all means, but not because it should guarantee us the status of victim, but because we want people to understand what justice is. And we want people to understand what peace is, and we want people to understand who we really are, because we are not a nation of victims. We are the children of Abraham and Sarah, and we are the children of Torah. And that is not a document, an ideology of faith, of victimhood. That is an ideology, a doctrine, a faith, a life, a history, a tradition, a nation of people who stand for what is right and stand against what is wrong, for people who believe in peace and justice, for people who believe that there is a holy God that has infused this world with holiness, and that we are the instruments of ensuring that the world becomes more godly with every passing moment. And we can't do that if we are victims. And we can't do that if we are victimizers. We can only do that if we are B'nai Israel, the true children of Israel, the true children of God. And if we hold to Torah with all of our heart, with all of our might, and with all of our soul. So don't fight and argue about who is more deserving of the sympathy of victimhood. Fight and argue about what is right and what can be done to make this world more holy, to make this world more godly, and to stand up against those who would try to exploit this narrative of victimhood only to spread pain and blood. Shabbat Shalom. On page 354, Judichisi's our Sifat Ibor leads us in our Musa service.